So this is going to be a basic review of first through fourth species counterpoint for your use. Note that this is a very rudimentary review and we won't cover every minutia in detail. If you would like to do that, you can refer to whatever textbook you may be using for species counterpoint, but I particularly recommend, of course, Study of Counterpoint by Fuchs. This is a good book, historically relevant. The only problem is that Fuchs' textbook is quite dated, and so it is full of problems and errors. If you're looking for a more modern and critical study that goes through everything in great detail and is much more accurate, I recommend Yepeson's Counterpoint book, which is available in paperback. This is going to be a much more advanced study for those interested in counterpoint, but will give you much more accurate and detailed information on each species. If you're looking for a very concise manual of rules, there are plenty out there. One that I particularly recommend, which is no longer in print, but there are thousands of used editions online that you can find, is Stella Roberts and Erwin Fisher's A Handbook of Modal Counterpoint. This book goes through each species with 2, 3, and 4 and more voices and gives you concise rules for melodic motion as well as harmonic uses for each of the species. So we will begin with a quick overview of first species counterpoint with a couple examples and discussion of the rules and some general guidelines. Again, the rules will vary from person to person, class to class, and book to book. So there are some soft rules and some hard rules that you'll encounter. I'm going to just cover the most strict rules that most any course should cover. So first species counterpoint is note against note, one note at a time, usually done in whole notes. First, the intervals that you want to use primarily are the sixths and the thirds, major and minor, doesn't matter, but counterpoint is about the sixths and the thirds, not necessarily about the perfect intervals. You want to use them less frequently. Perfect fifth, the perfect octave, and occasionally perfect unison. These are going to be your consonant intervals for species counterpoint, all species counterpoint in fact, plus their octave equivalents, a 10th, 15th, what have you. Then you also have your dissonances. You will have your seconds, major and minor. You will have your tritone, diminished fifth, augmented fourth. You will have your sevenths. And importantly, you will have your perfect fourth. Perfect fourth in species counterpoint is considered a dissonance and should be treated as like a dissonance as you would a second, seventh, or a tritone. So when we're doing first species counterpoint, you really want to focus on the sixths and the thirds particularly, because you have very few notes in first species counterpoint. It's only one note per measure. So you really want to take advantage of that one note and not downplay it by making it perfect. You really want to reserve the perfect intervals for structural moments like the beginning and the end. So in first species counterpoint, you will always begin on a perfect interval. If we are in species above, that is, if you are writing your counterpoint above the cantus firmus, you can start with perfect unison, perfect fifth, or perfect octave above the cantus firmus. If you are starting with your counterpoint below, that is, what you are writing is below a given cantus firmus, you may begin with the perfect unison or the perfect octave. Note, you cannot begin with the perfect fifth below. It's very important. Furthermore, note that all of these are perfect intervals. You cannot begin on a third. You cannot begin on a sixth. You can definitely not begin on a second or a seventh. You can only begin on the perfect intervals and not a fourth. Fourth, even though it's a perfect interval, is absolutely considered a dissonance. You know, you might as well not even call it a perfect interval in this case, because it just confuses it with the actual consonants as a perfect unison, fifth, and octave. Fourth is not a consonant. So this is how you must begin. These are our beginnings. And our endings. Above, oh, really doesn't matter. Both above and below must end on a perfect unison or perfect octave. Not a perfect fifth, not a third, not a dissonance, only perfect unison and perfect octave. Melodically, you really want to constrain yourself to a small range and small leaps in first species counterpoint. Because it's really hard to go very far. I mean, if your cantus firmus is 8 notes, your melody is 8 notes. And so moving it around a lot is not optimal. We want your composed line to be singable. Very simple and easy to sing. And so, you know, writing a melody line like this is, you know, it follows some rules. It's like, okay, well, I leap, and then I leap and go in the opposite direction, and then I go in the opposite direction, and then I leap again, and then, you know, it's like, okay, well, these are all following some, you know, rules here and there, but this is not a singable line for most rudimentary singers. So we want some really smooth, scale-wise lines with small leaps. So really try to constrain your leaps in this species to minor and major thirds, mostly, with an occasional perfect fourth leap. That is a leap, not an interval, harmonic interval. It is a leap, a melodic interval. Be sure to not leap the tritone. So a melodic leap from F to B is not a perfect fourth. It's a back leap of a tritone. It's not allowed. You can leap perfect fifths. Some people say you can't. I'll say you can. They're all arbitrary rules anyways. But you can certainly leap a fifth in this species. I would not leap any more than that. Some people can say you can leap an octave. Pushing it there. But for now, in first species, I think you'd be best off if you only limit yourself to minor and major thirds and perfect fourths for your melodic leaps. Harmonic intervals we've discussed. Try to stick mostly to thirds and sixths. That will be your key area. So let's do an example now. All right. So we will do cantus firmus above. We are in the Mixolydian mode. Here we have our cantus firmus. This is what it sounds like. And we'll write a counterpoint. So starting below, we are limited to either to a unison or an octave. When the cantus firmus begins by going down, I don't usually suggest, especially if you're writing below. So particularly when you're writing below, if the canvas firmness moves down at the beginning, starting on a unison is not your best option because you're immediately going to run into cross voicing and problems with that. So I recommend starting an octave down in this instance. Now, our goal is to achieve as much contrary motion as possible. So, whenever given the opportunity, we should seek to find those options available to us which will give us contrary motion, not the ones that will give us similar motion, either similar or parallel or oblique. So here, the most obvious, first solution to contrary motion is the A, right? Which gives us an octave and 6. Now we can actually continue this kind of neighbor pattern just mirrored in the bass really easily. Right, so we've really just done the inversion of the top and the bass, which is a nice solution actually to a lot of portions of first species counterpoint exercises. There's of course plenty of cases where you can't do this, especially in long scalar passages like this, where the inversion or the mirror will just not work out very well. But in neighbor passages like this, mirror configurations work great. So the bottom line sounds like this. Together at the top. Now of course, it results in a number of octaves, but notice they're not directly next to each other. So these are not parallel octaves. In fact, they're even the same octave. It's G, 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 G. So there's not even any chance of necessarily creating some kind of moving octaves, which would give us parallel octaves. They're actually the same octave. Furthermore, they're approached every time by contrary motion, which makes them even more permissible. So, in my book, these octaves are fun. You might find some people that might find them problematic though, but I think for a basic counterpoint, they're very fun. Now, we have a lot of perfect intervals here, 3 octaves already. We probably want to limit ourselves to mostly 6s and 3rds and their octave compounds for the rest of the example. So, let's try to find the rest of the solution. So now we should continue as far as possible to find contrary motion is what we're doing, though occasional similar motion is fine. So the next choice I would do to start giving us some 3rds rather than perfect intervals, because obviously you can see, well, if we do contrary motion, we can easily just go down to the F, right? That'll give us a 5th, and they're contrary to the octave, so it's not a bad 5th, but it's just getting too perfect. I mean, it's not a wrong solution, but it's not the best solution or even one of the better ones. So in this case, we might opt to go in similar motion up to this 10th. Which is fine. Now we could, of course, create a long chain of 10ths here, going all the way down to this D. That's a possibility. And then, of course, from this D, we might do this to give us our resolution. That can work. It depends, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 10ths in a row, plus 6 10ths in a row. That's a lot of 10s. People will generally frown on that. So we might want to just do a few, and then try to get 6s rather than 10s. So a possibility would be this. So we go down here, we have a 10, we Now, as I said before, we can do leaps of thirds and leaps of fourths. So here I opted to leap fourth, which then now takes us to the realm of sixes. 6, 6, 6. And then here, we can leap a third to give us our final resolution. And this takes us back to the realm of tens. So we only have 3 sixes in a row, which is fine. And gives us our nice cadence. Of course, if you would like, you could add your accidental to make it a nice leading tone cadence. This is what it sounds like. First species is pretty rudimentary, one note against one note. If you confine yourself, as I've said, to small leaps, searching for contrary motion where you can, you'll find that your solution is pretty easily found. And if you can't find the solution pretty easily, you've probably done something wrong or are trying to do something wrong. So just keep in mind, mostly tens or thirds, mostly sixes. And you shouldn't run into too much trouble. Don't leap tritones. Remember, fourths are not consonant interval. Next, we'll quickly review second species. Second species, of course, deals with 2 notes against 1 note. Important things to note before beginning is that you cannot repeat any notes in second species. I mean, of course, you can repeat them at a later point, but you can't have them directly juxtaposed. You can't have the same note directly juxtaposed. So, no repeats. Generally, the strictest form of this counterpoint only allows dissonances via passing tones, though some more watered-down versions of counterpoint classes will allow upper or lower auxiliaries as dissonant tones as well. The important thing to note is that dissonant tones only happen on the weak beat of the measure. What I recommend really is as you go through, this is just an abstract example. Doesn't really matter about the notes. We have a note here, some pianist service note, doesn't matter. But mark whatever you have here, 2 intervals, and be sure to remember that 7s and 2s and tritones are dissonant, and remember your consonant intervals. But whenever you come across a dissonant interval, circle it. Okay? Now, if you happen to circle the number that is at the beginning of the measure, you've immediately made a mistake. There cannot be any dissonance at the beginning of a measure in second species, only in the second half of the measure. So, if this was your example, you would be wrong. And if you find that to be the case, immediately erase and try again. In which case you might get, GW. And then you're like, W is dissonant. Okay, you're probably better off in this case. You might even find that you get this, and neither are dissonant. That is also fine. But really, this is your dissonant note. This is your consonant note. If this is not your dissonant note, it must also be consonant. You cannot have any dissonance here. Again, dissonances arise out of passing tones, or if you're in some kind of easier counterpoint class that allows, a little bit more leeway, With the rules, they can also arise out of upper or lower neighbor tones. But as a consequence of them being upper or lower neighbor tones, or passing tones, dissonances cannot be leapt from or leapt into. They can only be approached or left by step. So, if you have 3 notes in the second species, right? Don't care what the Cantus firmus note is. It's an abstract example. This is our dissonant note. This is our consonant note. This is our consonant note. This is the correct formation of the passing tone. You might circle that. It is approached by step and left by step. Similarly, you might have this. Of course, in a more watered down version of counterpoint, where this is actually permissible, you might have a dissonance and consonance. This is approached by step and left by step. Back to where it came from, this is an upper auxiliary or upper neighbor tone. This is also permissible. But note that they are both on the second half of the measure. They've both been approached by step and left by step. Doesn't matter the number, it could be 6, 7, 3. 7 doesn't, go directly to 3. Well, it's not about the number that it's going to. It's literally just about these notes. You know this is consonant, you know this is dissonant, you know this is consonant. Well, it has to go by step, or a step like that. Or we can have it as a lower neighbor too. That could also be dissonant. But note that this, again, is not in strict counterpoint classes. This is not allowed in second species, actually. Upper neighbors and lower neighbors are only allowed to be consonant in second species, in a strict sense. Of course, always avoid parallel fifths between the measures, parallel octaves between the measures, and parallel unisons between the measures. Speaking of unisons should only ever be on the second half of the measure. So you have a note, and you have a note. This is a 2, or no, it wouldn't be 2, so that's a distance. This is a 3 to 1. This one is permissible. Good. Second half of the measure. If this is a 1 to 6, let's say, this is not permissible. Ones in most rule books that I have surveyed, 1 is not usually allowed on the first half of the beat. So if you're worried about parallel fifths, parallel octaves, things like that, these numbers come in handy again. Because if you just, you don't even need notes. If you have a string of numbers like this, this should immediately clue you into a problem of 2 5s next to each other. And that is a good indication of parallel fifths. So if you write in your numbers correctly, it should clue you into when you have these parallel fifths showing up. Because you should never have a fifth and a fifth, or an octave and an octave, or a unison and a unison juxtaposed. Like that. Similarly, fifths from the beginning of one measure to the beginning of the next measure, and even some stricter books from the end of one measure to the end of the next measure are not allowed. So this time we'll actually use clefs. So let's say we have this, going to this. I'll go ahead and put in the fifths as we would know it. Maybe you have selected to do this. There's a number of problems with this. So what you have is a fifth, and I'll have to do a fifth. First, you have way too many perfect intervals. You really shouldn't If you have that many perfect intervals next to each other, it should probably clue you into a problem is arising. But you'll notice that even though that this is approached in contrary motion, overall, the D to the E and this A to this B hint at, parallel fifths at almost a first species level. If we just ignore this note. This is not permissible. This is just hidden parallel fifths. This is a problem that many people run into. Leaps in the species, I would try to stick to thirds and fourths again as much as possible, though allowed are also fifths and even octaves in the species with very careful usage. But they can get you out of some sticky situations if you must. So let's do an example. All right. We will do counterpoint above. Cantus firmus will be in Dorian. For example, this is what it sounds like. All right, second species. Now, of course, we can start at the fifth above, the octave above, or the unison. Similar to the last example, if the cantus firmus begins by going up, you probably don't want to begin on the unison because you're immediately restricted to going up, and it's going to cause some awkward cross voicing. So begin with some distance away from the cantus firmus, unless it's moving in the opposite direction from the side of the cantus firmus you're starting on. So you can start with the fifth. I started with an octave. Of course, always remember that second species, you begin with the half rest. Right? Octave. Now, the goal is, again, fluid-like lines, scale-like motion. Second species, though, is going to be one of the hardest species to get that smooth scalar-like motion all the time. So, if you have leaps, they will be in second species, but again, try to limit them to fourths and thirds, and always step in the opposite direction as you leap. So if you leap up fourth, go down afterwards. If you leap down fourth, go up afterwards. It makes for easier singing, and so it became a convention. So, this is just how I opted to start. Alright. So here we have a fifth. We have a sixth. We have an octave. We have a sixth, and fifth. Alright? So immediately we're starting out with a number of perfect intervals, so we should immediately be clued into the possibility of some problems, like direct or parallel perfect intervals. But our fifth has been approached by contrary motion from the octave, so that's fine. And then our next octave is approached by contrary motion again. So this is not direct perfect intervals. These octaves are far enough apart so that the parallel between them is easily hidden and not a problem at all. And then this fifth is well enough away from the other fifth or the other octave to really cause any parallel problems with that. Now that we are here, I'll draw a little bar line to help us kind of see where we are. We could continue down by a scalar step, but of course we'll start to run into some problems with the collision to this line. So we might want to try to move out of the way. It's always good to try to look ahead, try to not run into the cantus firmus, and plan where you would like to go. I mean, generally you want a high point somewhere around 2/3 of the way through. You want your climax to be at the golden mean, and then kind of descend back to some kind of, octave or unison. So maybe we want to try to bring it up to have our high point within here. So I opted to use our permissible octave leap. Sometimes people will say leaping with the cantus firmus is problematic, but since the cantus firmus is stepping and we are leaping, it's okay. The leap is on an accented beat, which makes it even more permissible, not agogically accenting the offbeat. Now, because we do this, it actually allows us to do a very elegant descent. I decide to flatten the beat. That's just a stylistic thing. It doesn't need to be flattened, but you can flatten the beat. Sometimes it will be vital that you flatten it. In this case, it's not that important. So, I'm going to compress our intervals just so that we don't have to think about tenths and twelfths and things like that. So here we have a sixth, a fifth, a third, a second, a third, a fourth, a sixth, and a fifth. We'll go through and circle our dissonances. You'll notice that they happen on the offbeats. This gives us a very elegant scalar-like passage, which is rare to find sometimes in second species. Now, since the end descends like this, it's going to be very awkward if we try to cross over this E in our upper line and match this D in a unison. So we'll probably opt to end up here. Now we can just follow conventional formulas and know that we'll probably do this, get to our end. So now we have to find some kind of way to get from here to here, from A to D, a whole step, fill in this kind of area between them with something that is interesting and not just noodling around. There are many solutions, obviously. This is the one I chose. Which gives us another nice octave leap. I really like those. Maybe some people don't. All right. So here we have cross voicings from the A here to the F, crosses over this A. Some people will not permit that and say that's a bad thing, it shouldn't be done. A lot of sources say that it is appropriate. If you go to the actual music of the composers we're talking about when studying species counterpoint, they do this all the time. So if your class prohibits it, it's prohibited. but honestly, it's a thing that they do, and so prohibiting it is, not necessarily a advisable thing. But if it's permitted, or if it's prohibited, then it's prohibited. But for me, it's not. So I cross voices and then left another octave, kind of keeping with this motive of downward scales and leaps of octaves. I thought that would be nice. Then I get here to this D, which forms a nice 6. And these aren't lined up very well, actually. F, F, and then E, D. Yes. And, oh, I see what I've done now. I wrote what I wanted to write incorrectly. So I decided actually that I wanted to end with a whole note. We'll discuss that. So I get down to this third, leaping off of this 6. This is the leap of a perfect fourth. Leap down to a perfect fourth is fine, and notice I've followed it by filling in the gap between these two notes, the B and the C. So this leap of the fourth is perfectly fine. Just like after I left the octave, I actually filled in that octave. After I left this octave, I filled in a significant portion of it. So I've kind of atoned for my sin of leaping an octave, if you will. In second species, you can make the last measure a whole note against the whole note. That is fine if you so choose. You don't have to, but that is an option that is available to you. Keep it in mind. So going in and finishing this, just add in the intervals to make it clear. So we have a third to a 6 to a 6, go down to a 5th, leaping to a 3rd, moving up through a 4th, passing motion to 6, and then to an octave. I've added the C sharp. The B natural does not, or the B flat does not carry through, so it's B natural. This gives us a nice cadence. You certainly don't have to add the B natural or C sharp. You can keep it as a B flat and C natural if you don't want to add the ficta to make a cadence, but it sounds kind of nice. Just be sure to add the natural because the B flat to a C sharp is an augmented second, which is not permissible in the style. This is what it sounds like. Unlike its name, third, it actually has 4 notes against 1 note, not 3, at least in what we're studying here. The important things to remember in third species counterpoint is that your dissonances only happen on beats 2 and beats 4 of any measure. Your consonances always happen on beats 1 and 3. Now, consonances can happen on beat 2 and 4. That's fine. But they must happen on beats 1 and 3. And dissonances can only happen on beats 2 and 4. So, you have to make sure of anything. If you circle an interval, like 3, 4, 5, 6. The dissonant interval in here is 4. Circle it. Is it on beat 2 or beat 4? If yes, then you are probably fine. If no, then you are certainly wrong. Dissonances must happen only on beat 2 and 4. Consonances can happen on any beat, but you definitely have to have consonants on 1 and 3. There's a special case called the Nuja Cambiata, which is our first instance of being able to leap from a dissonance. So if you remember in second species, you could pass through a dissonance, or in a less strict species or use of species counterpoint, you could do an upper or lower auxiliary dissonance, which is a step 2 and then a step back from. But here we can actually leap off of a dissonant note. So the figuration follows this kind of shape abstractly. So you're going to have some note, then you're going to move to some kind of dissonant note, then you're going to leap down by a third to some consonant note, and then move up through to finally another consonant note. So generally, the pattern follows consonant to dissonant, consonant, and consonant. Now here, rule books will differ sometimes as to whether this can be dissonant or this can be consonant, or if it can only be one or won't be the other. Generally, it's going to be, if you do the Nuja Cambiata correctly, it's going to be consonants. But it can also be dissonance, if you so choose. Now, if you're told one thing specifically in your class, that this must be a consonance, this must be a dissonance, then follow that. But in my practice, it can be either or. It's not that important. So, for an example, let's do it off of, where do I have it? Here we go, an F. So off of an F, let's say we have a C here. And a B flat here. Of course, it could be a B natural, doesn't matter. At this point, so we have a fifth going to a fourth. Now the fourth is a dissonance. But if we want to do a Nuja Cambiata, we could leap down by a third. Now you of course have to check yourself at this point that, well, if I do this figuration, this note must be a consonant note. G to E, yes. We have checked. The third, we are good. Now, by convention, we must go back up. Now, E to A is fourth. I'm going to say that's fine. But we'll circle it because it is a dissonance. Note it does happen on the second beat. So it follows that rule, which makes it fine. And we'll continue to move up to make the complete figuration with a B or a B flat, but actually we won't do B flat for against the E. That would create a tritone. But we'll just keep it a B natural, which gives us a fifth. This is a perfectly fine Nuja Cambiata figuration. Note that Nuja Cambiata usually begins on beat 3 or beat 1 of a measure. Most rule books will say it does not ever begin on beat 2 or beat 4 of a measure. The Nuja Cambiata does not have to be used in fourth species. It is just an option available to you to treat dissonances if you ever box yourself into a corner. Now, of course, your instructor might, require you to use Nuja Cambiata at least once in an exercise, just so that you can demonstrate your knowledge of it. But you certainly aren't required to unless someone tells you to do it. So don't feel pressured to use it. You can certainly go through many third species counterpoint exercises without ever having to use Nuja Cambiata. So No pressure to use it. Third species, since it is the most note proliferate species, lends itself very well to scale-like motion because you can easily cover 4 notes in a scale over 1. So ultimately, you want as fluid of a line as possible, searching for as many scales as you possibly can do. Leaps of thirds are very handy in this, because for the most part, leaps of thirds are very tiny, especially if you have something like a minor third, like an E to a G. A minor third is the smallest interval that is not a second. So the leap of a minor third in many books, especially in this species, is almost not even considered a leap. You don't have to follow this leap by a step in the opposite direction. You can just leap this and just go right on up the scale. Doesn't matter. But you can use the third to facilitate more scale-like motion, because you don't have to go in the opposite direction when you just leap a third, especially a minor third. Now when you leap fourths, it's a different case. You should go in the opposite direction. Leaping octaves, again in this species, is also very useful because, if you get a long scale passage going up, you'll eventually get to the stratosphere of your voice, and you'll need a way to get quickly down, which could be really hard if your cantus firmus is also moving down at the same time, because you might run into lots of parallel problems. So a good way to quickly get down and be able to move back up in the opposite direction as the cantus firmus is to use an octave leap. So keep those in mind. They can be very useful to get you out of a tight spot at the extreme of registers, or to get you moving quickly in the opposite direction as the cantus firmus when it quickly changes directions. Leaps of minor sixes can also be very useful. So in this species, a lot of books will permit leaps of minor sixes, not usually major sixes. So that's also a trick that you can have up your sleeve if you need. Another large leap that can get you moving in another direction. If octaves don't seem to work, or they don't seem to give you exactly what you want, frequently a good use of a minor six would be to leap up a minor six and then move down slightly, either by step or a minor third, and then continue up. You see that a lot with the use of the minor six, to try to give you this upwards trajectory, while a leap of an octave generally will give you a totally downwards trajectory. Because after you leap an octave, you definitely have to go down, but then leaping an octave and going down just a little bit and then continuing up, you're going to get really high really quickly. So generally you leap an octave and go really far in the opposite direction for a long time. Whereas a minor six, you could go up the octave and further by leaping this minor six as kind of a via point en route to that octave. If for some reason the cantus firmus doesn't allow easy scale like step passages. Be sure to keep an eye out for the use of tritones on the measure again. A lot of people will just get so full of, oh, look at all the notes, they're so great, that they don't notice that when they have an F, for example, that B is in fact should do it the other way. Do I have any B's in this example? No. Well, sure. So if you have a B, let's say, an F is not a consonant interval. And in most species counterpoints, the use of F sharp is not as widely accepted as the use of B flat as musica ficta. So generally you might want to flatten B, but your cantus firmus notes are usually fixed and you can't just add accidentals to cantus firmus notes. So depending upon your teacher's allowance for F sharps, you might be able to do that, but that's not usually as permissible as the use of B flats. So be careful not to write diminished fifths where they're actually, thinking that they're perfect fits. This one's a D. So let's do an example. Oh, one last note is that you can't end a third species exercise with 2 quarter notes, a half note, and a whole note. You can do that at the end of an exercise only. So you don't have to have like a full measure of quarter notes. And similarly, at the beginning, you usually begin with a quarter rest and then start at the typical intervals for beginning of these end species counterpoint. So we have a long example here. It's at the top, goes all the way over here, and you ignore this, then we go back down over here, the bottom system, and in here. So we got a lot of notes to write, but generally we want to start low and move high, and then go back down. So we might find that somewhere around here is going to be our high point. It might be a little bit after, it might be a little bit before. Since I felt like we were probably going to go very high, because generally you're going to cover a much larger range in third species than you are in second species, and especially first species. And most books permit you to write a larger range, in fact. I'm going to start low, especially since our canvas firmly starts low. So I'm going to start on the D here, and actually move downwards. So our canvas firmness begins by moving up, so I'll move down in contrary motion, searching as much as possible for scales. So first I'm going to go, well, how far can I go down by scale before I can't anymore? Maybe it won't be very far, maybe it'll be very far. But let's just test the waters. You can always test things and then erase as needed. I'm going to do B flat. Again, that's just me. You don't have to. Though some people might problematize the cross relationship between B natural and that F very close afterwards, but that's a more strict and nitpicky rule. So then I get down to this A. So far that works great. So I have an octave, a ninth, and then a sixth, and then a third. So the scale-wise step passage works great. Now I can't really go any lower, at least in a full scale trajectory, but something to note is that dissonances in this species can not only be passing tones, but can also be lower neighbors, and in less strict classes, upper neighbors as well. But strict textbooks will tell you only lower neighbors, but less strict textbooks might tell you upper neighbors are fine. So, in this regard, I could actually do a lower neighbor, which is going to require me to go back up, and it's going to send my scale trajectory upwards again, which is probably appropriate since the canvas firmness is going down, and I've really reached as low as I can go at this point without crossing the canvas firmness. Now, can I go up by scale? Well, let's see. How far can I go up? So if I continue, I hit a C. That works fine. C, D, E. Now, if I go to an F and then a G, if I have a G here, I have a problem because G is a fourth. Can't have a fourth on a strong D. So my scale has to stop here. Because I have to, if I did the F, I definitely have to step off of it because the F would be a dissonant interval with the E. So I'd have to either step up to the G, which is dissonant, or step down to the E, which is dissonant. So I really can't go up anymore without doing something first. So I'm going to do this, which brings up a nice topic. So in third species, there's lots of little figurations which help you to noodle, like I call it, a measure. You just kind of like fiddle around, you don't do much. This measure really doesn't do that much in the big scheme of things. It goes from C to C, which goes nowhere. So I mean, I could write this as a big whole note C, and we really have first species. And there's lots of figurations like this. I could go down in this same regard and do like C, C, B, A, C. And you know, there's plenty of noodling figures that just basically orbit a pitch. And this helps to not necessarily stall motion, because it continues the motion by having it in quarter notes, and it kind of suggests an upward motion, but we go back down because we can't quite go all the way up like we want to yet. But we might be able to in time. For example, now. So now, I mean, I still want to kind of continue to go up, but against this line, so I want to try to find some way where I can get back to where I wanted to be. I really wanted to be an F to G. But I couldn't do the F here, but guess what? I could do the F here. With D against F, it's a fine interval down. So I'll leap down by a third, which is a negligible leap, and then I leap up a fourth. This is a common figure in fourth species. It is leapy, but this is a rather small leap, quite negligible, and then I leap up a fourth. Now, when I leap up a fourth, I should go down. It creates a dissonance, but it's on the second beat, so that's fine. I'm going to opt, because I really want to try to continue to go up, so I don't want to start pulling down again. So I'm going to try to noodle around F, because I really want to try to maintain that F. F. This is just another example of a noodling figure. It might suggest downwards motion, but ultimately my trajectory is still upwards because I have C's with F's. So I am really moving this upwards, because you notice the low note here is C, the low note here is D, the high note here is E, the high note here is F. So the trajectory is going upwards. Now from this D, I can move up to the E by step. And now I think, yes, we get what we've finally been searching for. Scale. This kind of leaves us in suspense for that scale we're wanting. How far can we go? Well, I go up to the B flat, and then I could maybe continue upwards. If we continue to go up much more, we're going to start getting very far out of, you know, the permissible range between these voices. So maybe I want to start limiting how far I want to go. I could go B, C, D, E. That will be fine. The only problem is if I continue this now, I get an F, and here we really have direct octaves. That's a problem. I could go down from the E to the D and have an upper neighbor dissonant note. That's not necessarily the strictest thing to do, because it's not allowed in the strictest form of this species. Though if it's allowed for you, by all means. But I'm going to try to do the strictest I possibly can at this point, so I'm not going to do the E. So, but I'm wanting to still try to get my highest point somewhere around here, so I still want to push it up maybe to the D. Kind of the octave ambitus of our piece. So I'm going to do some more noodling while I prolong our anticipation for the climax of our piece. Actually, sorry. And hold on, yes. Sorry, that's what I want. So here I have 6, 5, 3, 5. Totally noodling. You know, just, sorry. 4. You know, mostly consonant intervals. And now I'm passing, maybe suggesting more of a scalar motion. How far can I go? So now if I continue to go up here, get a D and then an E, I can't do that because I have a D here, so scale step up is not perfect yet. So perhaps we try noodling again. Here we have 3, 4, 5, 3. So this 4 was passed through, this 4 was passed through. It's fine. And then from here, I could leap up and up. Here we finally get our C to our D, our octave from our original final to our octave higher final is reached close to where I wanted it. So now I really need to start moving back down. So let's see how far I can go down before I have to find an alternative solution to just simple scale passage work. That all works fine. 8, 7, 6, 5. So now I had an A previously, so just note that there's an A here. Now I'm going to actually leave down a third, because I can't go down to the G, can't stay on the A, can't go up to the B, don't really want to go back up any higher than the B, because that's just going to take me back up to my pinnacle point, and I don't want to double that. So I'm going to just leave down the third, that's perfectly fine. And if I start going down, it's going to lead into problems, because then I'll have dissonant notes on parts of the measure that don't permit dissonant notes. So in this case, my alternate solution, again, kind of a noodle, but it's going to give us something a little bit more interesting perhaps. Then I'm going to leave an octave. It's really going to move me it's going to actually match this A, but it's going to give me a lot of room to start moving in contrary motion to the cantus firmus, which is now moving down, whereas before it had kind of been moving up in its trajectory, now it's moving down. So I really can't move up from here without going really high again. So I really need to get down quickly so that I can move up to an appropriate level by the end. So I'm going to leap down to the A. It's off of the strong beat before the bar line, so it's not agonically accented. It's not doing anything weird to our metrical accent, so it's fine. And I'm going to atone for this evil, vile sin of leaping an octave by going upwards. And this works fine. I start having thirds. And in fact, I can continue this passage work up for quite a while. Getting up to the F. At the point that I get to the F, I really don't want to go much higher because I'm getting closer to that D again, and I really want to stay around this D. Because I think I want to end here where I began and not end up at this D, which I'm really highlighting here. I don't want the same high point at any other point in the piece. So at this point, I'm going to do another little nifty trick and leave another octave down, which is fine, because I've kind of filled in that gap with that octave within the octave and then left down, and I will atone by going up again, which works out. G, the A. Oh, sorry. That's not working. I've written it. What I have to do is leap up the third to the A, and then move up to the B. It's fine. Leap up a third is a negligible leap in this species especially. Note that this B is a B natural. And then I'm going to have an end on that D right before it. I'll probably want C sharp. And then I just kind of need the noodle here, so I'll just do a nice C sharp, B natural, lower neighbor tone. This gives me a 6-5-6 to an octave. There we go. It's quite a long one. Very elegant in my opinion. We start off low and we work our way, building and building and building, consistently holding back until we reach a high point around 2/3 of the way through the exercise, and then consistently move down through the piece with some nice, very effective leaps down until we reach where we began, giving us this lovely circular motion. We have one low point as well at this F. So this melody achieves a lot in just what is generally considered an exercise. Okay, the last thing we're going to cover is fourth species. This will not cover fifth species. So fourth species deals with ties. Ties over the bar line specifically. So this is the first example in species counterpoint where you can essentially have a note that is repeated, and it is repeated via tie. These ties specifically allow us to begin to use dissonant suspensions, though you don't necessarily have to have dissonant suspensions when you tie. But the goal of this is to create as many of those dissonant suspensions as you can reasonably create. Though occasionally you might actually have to revert to second species, which we'll discuss, or you might just tie over to a consonant interval. So dealing with suspensions, you first really need to understand what a suspension is really about, especially in this style. So suspension has, well first, actually let me just explain exactly what suspension really is. So I mean, if we think about what suspension is in reality, when you suspend something, you hold it out. And of course, you can hold this out forever and never, think about what could possibly happen after you hold it out. Or you could just say, never mind, I'm not, let me change, go back and rethink this, whatever I'm doing by holding this out. In which case, the suspension essentially never happened. You've changed your mind. But if you decide to suspend something over a cliff or whatever, just over the floor, if I continue this action, eventually I will have to let it fall. If I'm going to go through with something and not just kind of take it back. And if I open my hand and release the object, it will at some point fall and hit the ground via gravity. And so when we suspend a note, over a bar line, it's not going to suddenly go up in this style. I mean, certainly you can do these things in other styles, but in this style, we're not thinking we suspend and then it goes, flies up. I release the ball and it, flies to the moon. It doesn't do that. It falls to the ground. So suspensions are you have suspended something over a, cliff. Here's your cliff. Actually, it should be suspended over a cliff. There's your cliff. And then you let it drop and it falls. And I mean, it can continue falling for a long time, but it first must fall one step before it falls anywhere. It must first, begin its fall. So that is the first kind of essential part of suspending something. Now, suspension also has to deal with suspense, right? So we're creating some kind of tension. If you have a suspenseful moment, sitting in, you're going to get your haircut and you're sitting waiting for your turn to get a haircut. This waiting is not usually very suspenseful. It's just boring. That is not suspenseful moments are about waiting, anticipation, but there's usually some kind of tension, some disconcerting element that's going on. Like there's some lack of information. You need to know more. There is some kind of dissonance, if you will. And this happens the same way in music. If I have, Let's say your Cantus firmus is a D. There's something here, don't care what it is. I have an A. And I've decided to suspend that A. And the Cantus firmus moves to an F. Well, I have a 5 to a 3. Both of these are consonant intervals. I've not really created any kind of disconcerting element in this. There's nothing that I have done to make you necessarily desire some resolution. You know, you could be like, well, we have a young girl and she walks into the woods. Like, okay, that's fine. She's an avid hiker. Okay, so girl walks into the woods and she's an avid hiker, so I assume she's just going on a hike. What's so terrible about that? Oh. It's warm outside. Is it particularly hot? No, it's just warm. She has a drink of water. I'm just making this up. You know, she has a drink of water and sits for a rest. Like, you know, nothing interesting has really happened. We just have a bunch of consonants. I have not really given you any tension with this story. A girl walks into the woods, she's an avid hiker, she goes on the hike, and it's a typical hike. Whoop-de-doo, why did I tell you this story? Is there any point to this story other than, you know, maybe you know this girl, I don't know, but really there's not much interest in this story. There's no kind of twist, there's no development, there's no tension which needs resolution. Now, if I was like, okay, change my notes. You're like, doesn't matter what's here, something's here. Okay. A girl walks into the woods. There's an axe murderer in the woods. Oh, that seems a little bit more problematic. You know. Girl gets killed by axe murderer. Typical plot of any horror film that is overly cliche. But it gives you typical setup, typical suspense, typical resolution. But like, when you see this, you do become somewhat concerned. You're like, why on earth? I mean, girl going into the forest is a fine thing, you know, no problem with that if you're an avid hiker, but like if it's nighttime and there's an axe murderer out, why the hell did you go into the forest? You know, and so now you're like, well, what's going to happen? Will she get out of the forest alive? I don't know. Well, we could end here, and that would be a fine postmodern ending to our piece, not letting you, know what happens, but we're not working in postmodernism, we're working in Renaissance polyphony, so we'll let you know what happens, and so happens that she dies. Or maybe she lives. Either way, it's a perfectly fine resolution, but we need to resolve it. But of course, we don't need to resolve it if there is nothing to resolve, but here there is something to resolve. So we need suspense to actually have a suspension. We need some kind of preparation, some kind of setup. We need something to, have some information to know, time, place, character, whatever. And then we need some kind of, suspense. That gets us interested, boy lives with disgruntled, godparents and has a miserable life. Turns out he's a wizard and is being hunted by the most powerful wizard of all time. Oh, okay, well that's a little bit more interesting, and then there's a resolution. I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read the book, but then we have some kind of resolution. Of course, this is not encapsulating the entire narrative arc of a long drama. This is a tiny drama, but this tiny drama can be woven with a bunch of other dramas, you know, to create a large story. This is just the most microcosmic version of drama, a preparation, a suspense, and a resolution. And you can, you know, combine these, you can concatenate these to create larger and larger structures of various kinds of suspense and resolution and delays and prolongations and what have you. But this is the proper way to create a suspension. And if you do this incorrectly, you miss the entire point of fourth species, and you'll get most of it wrong. So if you're going to create a suspension, it has to have a consonant preparation, a dissonant suspension, and a consonant resolution, which is achieved by a step down. And this, of course, has to be tied over. Prepare, tied, resolve, down. Now, of course, like I showed you, if all these happen to be consonant, you can do whatever you want. You can tie it over, of course, but if it's a tie over to a consonant interval, for example, like this, 6 or 3, I don't need to resolve that. There's nothing to resolve. It's perfectly consonant. There's no problem with it. I can move wherever I want, within reason, of course. Whatever. That's allowed. All other rules apply still about, you know, melodic writing and harmonic writing. You'll find that leaps happen more often in this species as well, but try to confine yourself to leaps of fourths or thirds. There's usually a solution where you can do that, or of course stepwise motion. You might find that leaps of an octave will get you out of a sticky situation, so keep those in mind as well. I'll just cut this part out. Need to figure out which one I'm going to do. So the last example I'm going to work for you is fourth species counterpoint. We are in the Phrygian mode, and I will be doing the fourth species above. And I'm going to do it on the same staff, so you can actually more closely see the interaction of the two voices. So they'll be done together. All right, so again, you have to start at either a fifth or an octave. I chose to start at a fifth. I mostly chose to start at a fifth because it immediately gets me into suspensions. And that's my goal, is to create as many of these dissonant suspensions as I can. So I might as well, if I can, and do something reasonable, start with one. So I start with a fifth, which then goes to a ninth. Immediately, I circle the ninth. It's a dissonance. I've tied it over. It must resolve down by step. It resolves down by step to an octave. That's fine. And then, if I can, I'm going to try to create more of these suspensions until I can't anymore. So I might as well try. Give it a try. See what happens. So here I have a seventh. It has had a consonant preparation dissonance. Must resolve down to another consonant. B to G is a 6. Checks off. Can I continue this? Well, 6 goes to a fifth. Well, that's not a dissonance, it's a consonance. That's fine, but it's not any kind of suspension necessarily. So after that, I can actually move in whatever direction I want within reason. Now, this half of the measure has to really be, it really has to be consonant. The dissonances in this species only happen on the first beats via suspension. So I can't really go down to the F because that creates a fourth. I could go down to the E and then maybe up to the F. That's certainly an option. I could leap up to the C and then go down to the B. That might be an option. I chose to do what ultimately resulted in the longest chain of suspensions that I could muster, which was leap the octave. As you continue to notice, I love leaping the octave. Alright, so now I'll explain why this works out nicely. So 5, consonant preparation, dissonant suspension, and then goes, I'm going to compress the intervals, so it's third. So now to show you why I ultimately picked this, I'm going to go all the way to the end. Which you can do, you can actually start at the end if you want. Descending passages like this in Cantus Fermi often tell you that you can do a nice formulaic ending, which you're probably familiar with at this point. So, my formulaic ending, since we're approaching it from above here, I'm going to approach it from below here. So, I can create a long chain of suspensions like this. So here I have 6 to an octave. This is a 7th, so 6, prepared by a 6, 7th, 6, prepared by a 3rd. Of course, a 10th if you decompress the interval. So I have this, an F, and I have a G to an F here. So I have to get from this F to this F while not doing something crazy. So I kind of have to find a way to keep the G as my high point or create a new high point and moving from this F to this F. So likely I need to pass from below this F and back up to this F, or I need to get to some higher point here. The solution that I picked goes down below this F and we'll come back up to it. So I see how far I can take these suspensions. Again, it's something you might just like guess and check. You know, just be like, well, let's see what happens. So this third consonant prep becomes a ninth, which then resolves to an octave. That's fine. Then, okay, let's see, how far can I keep it going? So this octave, consonant prep, becomes a seventh, which then I can resolve down to a sixth. Fine. Sixth goes to an octave. Okay, so I have consonant prep, consonant here, so it's not really suspension. So then I may move in whatever direction I want, which then allows me to go up, in fact, back to that F, which then leads me to the end. Fourth species you'll find is actually, one, at least in my opinion, one of the easier species to deal with as compared to second and third. Second is perhaps the hardest species, surprising, even though it's the second one you learn. Fourth is a lot easier because in essence it is like first. You have a lot less notes to write. It's just first, phased by, off shifted by half note. So here's what this sounds like. This is in Phrygian mode, if you hadn't noticed. Not quite as interesting as the last example we did, but this example works just fine. Follows all necessary rules and gets us the suspensions that this species is trying to teach us. We have one high point, we have one low point. So we've done a lot with something that's honestly not too interesting. With a cantus firmus, that is honestly quite tricky, because this isn't a very formulaic one that you see a million times, like, or, you see those kinds of, move up and descend down kind of figures, but this one immediately leaps down, which is not typical for many cantus firmi. A fifth to begin with, then we have a leap down by a third later, followed immediately by a leap up of a fourth. So this doesn't give us a nice descending, long descents that we can get in the cantus firmi, which can give us large formulaic passages of 7 to 6 suspensions, or 2 to 3 suspensions. So I showed you this example as kind of a tricky and exceptional cantus firmus that you might get on a quiz or a test. So that really covers all of the species for two voices where you're actually kind of more prescriptive. If you choose to move on to fifth species is basically a synthesis of the first through the fourth species with a couple of additions of things like dotted quarters and followed by eighth notes, those kinds of rhythms. But it teaches you to move freely between the species to begin creating actual composition rather than exercises. Again, if you're interested in pursuing those, I recommend these two books. Handbook of Modal Counterpoint. You can get it on a website like Amazon.com used. There's tons of copies of it floating around the world. It is currently out of print, but it's a great book that's very concise. And Nuja Cambiata's Counterpoint, the polyphonic vocal style of the 16th century. Very comprehensive, a good read, honestly. I mean, if you like academic reads. It really tells you a lot about the style, not just kind of dry rules that seem arbitrary, but it really tries to tell you why those rules evolved and exist and contextualizes them into something more than just an abstract list of things to follow. So check these books out if you're interested to learn more, to pursue things like the fifth species, since the two voices, and the species in 3 and 4 voices, as well as also these books include examples for canonic writing, so imitative writing in all of the species, as well as techniques for writing compositions with five or more voices or fugal style music from the 16th century.